So this video gives an overview of the key readings for topic 6, normalising inequality, and we have Nimal Puwar's study of the racialised somatic norm in the British Senior Civil Service. And then you have a choice. For the workshop, you can either read Elijah Anderson's article on the white space, based on in America, or Remy Joseph-Salisbury's account of institutionalised whiteness in British universities, and racial microaggressions in those contexts. So, as I say, you can choose between either of those two readings. So why are these the key readings for the topic? Why do we make you read these? This topic focuses on the normalisation of privilege, which various authors see as an institutional process that establishes certain socially dominant groups as either normal or expected in those spaces, i.e. in more privileged positions, whilst positioning other groups who don't fall within those categories as exceptional or out of place. So the argument here is that when people who are white or male or middle class not only dominate more privileged positions in politics, the labour market, the cultural sector or the media, but are also placed as the norm in such positions, what is expected, the consequence is that people who are not from those categories become constructed as abnormal and exceptional within them, which makes it much more harder for people to navigate those institutions. And the key readings for this topic all look at this process in relationship to questions of race. Puwar focuses on the intersection of class, race and gender in constructing what she calls a somatic norm in the British civil service and the very senior positions in the civil service. And for the workshop, you can choose either between the Anderson or Joseph-Salisbury readings. And Anderson looks at the formation of what he calls the white space in America, whilst Remy Joseph-Salisbury looks at the institutional whiteness of British universities. Both also argue that normalisation works unevenly to shape what different groups can see about power relations and what they take for granted in social arrangements. So we'll start off with Nimal Puwar's study. And she talks about how a somatic norm in institutions creates what she calls space invaders. So she argues that public institutions, and particularly the more privileged end of public institutions, develop a somatic norm which then constructs certain groups of people as invaders in the space. So somatic means bodily, so a somatic norm is the expectation that people will look, dress, behave in a particular way. And for Puwar, it refers to the normalisation of certain kinds of privilege in institutional context. Now, the concept, she didn't develop the idea of the somatic norm. It was originally developed in relationship to gender inequalities, as she acknowledges, to how men are seen to be more authoritative and competent than women, and for example, how people often expect doctors or civil servants to be men. Puwar extends the idea of the somatic norm intersectionally to include racial and class divisions. And she examines how particular classed, gendered and racialised social identities are taken as the norm or what is expected in institutional contexts, in her case by looking at the British civil service. Now, the civil service is formally at least based on meritocratic recruitment and promotion. But Puwar argues that ideas of expertise and authority are inseparable from what she calls the white male upper middle class body, so that when we find women or people from working class backgrounds or people of colour in these roles, they may seem by others as not only not quite fitting in, but may also be seen as less expert or authoritative. Now, Puwar sees this as an uneven process, and we'll see this throughout this in the key readings. She says dominant groups often don't see these processes because the racialised nature of white spaces, structures and languages is not so easily visible to white people, precisely because whiteness is defined as the norm and the standard neutral space. But she says that works very differently for people who don't fit the norm. because the somatic norm in institutions constructs certain groups of people as space invaders because spaces of authority are marked in this way, they produce female, working class or racialised bodies as what she calls bodies out of place. So she says that the assumption that a civil servant will be, particularly a senior civil servant, will be white, male and upper middle class is embedded into formal and informal practices and expectations. And that creates difficulties for people who fall outside the norm. She argues people of colour are constructed as space invaders in the civil service, not simply because they are present in lower numbers, but also because institutions assume white bodies as the norm, and authority and black bodies are therefore not naturally imagined together. That's a quote from Puwar. Because they are anomalies in places where they are not normally expected to be, their behaviour is more scrutinised, and people are much more likely to doubt their competency. So she says black civil servants must make extra efforts to make themselves visible as proficient and competent to get proper recognition. So they have to work harder to prove themselves. She also argues that because certain groups are positioned differently to the somatic norm, this also means their experience of such institutions and how they see what is normative is also very different. So we've already seen that she thinks that dominant groups often don't see the somatic norm. It's just not easily visible to white people because whiteness is defined as the norm and the standard neutral space. But she says, by contrast, black civil servants are keenly aware of these norms because they must make extra efforts to make themselves seen as proficient. And she says falling outside the somatic norm produces strong pressures towards assimilation or what she calls mimicry, if they want to gain recognition in these contexts. And by that she means people change how they talk or dress to better fit in. So, for example, a middle-class accent, or even better, a public school accent, might better assure people about your competency and that you belong. She says black civil servants must assimilate to a culture whose standards are white, upper middle class and male, and so some, at least, not all, but some try to erase and make invisible their blackness. They can succeed, but only if they are willing to mimic the somatic norm. Which shapes among them a more conscious awareness of how things work. We can see similar arguments made by Elijah Anderson when he talks about the white space in America. So Elijah Anderson argues that in America we can see the construction of key public spaces as what he calls white space. What does he mean by white space? He says their most visible and distinctive feature is the overwhelming presence of white people and the absence of black people. Now, this arises out of the white dominance of social spaces in America, where there are still overwhelmingly white neighbourhoods, schools, workplaces, restaurants and other public spaces, despite the end of legally enforced segregation in the 1960s. Black people perceive such settings as the white space, which they often consider to be informally off limits for people like them. And it's not just black people who think this, because black people in white spaces are often treated as suspicious or threatening, seen as out of place, and their presence is much more frequently challenged. So Anderson says when the anonymous black person enters the white space, others there immediately try to make sense of him or her, to figure out who that is, and to gain a sense of their business there and whether they might need to be concerned about the presence of that person. And ironically, he argues that the most easily tolerated black person in the white space is often one who is, he says, in his place. That is, for example, one who is working as a janitor or a service person. Now, one consequence of the institutionalisation of spaces as white is the heightened policing, both formal and informal, he says, of the black bodies who enter those spaces. And like Puwar, Anderson also argues that different groups have very different experiences of the same space, the white space. So there's a quote from Anderson here. When present in the white space, black people reflexively notice the proportion of whites to blacks. They may look around for other blacks with whom to commune or bond, and may adjust their comfort levels accordingly. When judging a setting as too white, they may feel uneasy and consider it to be off limits. For whites, however, the same settings are generally regarded as unremarkable or as normal, taken for granted reflections of civil societies. Now, that's in America, but Remy Joseph-Salisbury says we can see similar processes in British institutions and particularly in British universities, which is what he focuses on. So Remy Joseph-Salisbury looks at processes of what he calls institutionalised whiteness in British universities. And in particular, he examines a series of incidents in which black students or black lecturers were questioned or challenged about their presence on campus on the assumption that they didn't really belong there. And this is the assumption that universities are really, that white people go to universities. Now, he uses the concept of racial microaggressions to explore these processes. What is a racial microaggression? Well, it's the everyday racial slights and degradations that racially minoritized people experience. So, for example, when a black student in a university is mistaken for a cleaner or a member of the catering staff, for example. And microaggressions also occur when racial minorities are challenged about their right to be present in given institutional context. And he argues that these represent the main way racism works under what's sometimes termed post-racial conditions. A subterranean version of racism that emerges when explicit forms of racist talk or action are frowned on. Now, racial microaggressions are subterranean, he argues, because they can seem innocuous in isolation. A simple mistake or someone using the wrong terminology and so on. But he says the cumulative experience of such racial microaggressions and the fear that they might happen in those contexts, even if they don't actually happen, the fear that they could, he says really impacts on the well-being and life chances of racially minoritized people. Now, his argument, however, is that such microaggressions are not aberrations or one-off, and also they're not about the racial bias of the individuals who produce them. He says really they can only be understood by how they are mediated by institutional racism, by institutional whiteness. It is the institutional whiteness of the space that creates the conditions for the routine disruptions of invaders, and he's drawing on Puwar's work here. Racial microaggressions come about because the university is codified as a space of institutional whiteness, a space for white bodies. The microaggression, he says, comes as the consequence of the pre-marking of the space. And he makes an argument that we've seen in both the previous authors, that the experience of normalisation and the normalisation of whiteness means that subordinate groups, non-white groups, have a unique perspective on power relations. Why? Well, because normalisation means subordinate groups are often forced to negotiate environments in which they are exceptionalised, encountering norms and expectations which both exclude and judge them and make their life much harder. He argues, Remy Joseph-Salisbury argues, that potentially gives subordinate groups a unique and better perspective on privilege and power relations than dominant groups. He says that minoritized groups have a unique perspective on institutional whiteness, which comes from having to navigate the cumulative experience or the fear of microaggressions. So the claim here is that because subordinate groups have to negotiate normalisation as an uphill battle, they are better able to recognise power relations and are more aware of inequality and its normalisation than other groups. They have to be to be able to navigate those environments. But he says still that awareness doesn't necessarily lead to more positive results, because it's only through contestation that such normalisation becomes visible. So it's only when people point out and challenge the fact that those at the top of the social hierarchies tend to be mainly white or mainly male or from middle class private school backgrounds, for example, that it can be that normalisation can come into question. But that's quite hard to do. So we've looked at three key readings which look at things in rather different ways, but there are some commonalities in what they argue. So we're going to explore some of these arguments both in the lecture and the workshop. But firstly, drawing on your own experience, how does your experience at Manchester as a university relate to the arguments about normalisation made by Puwar, Anderson, and Joseph-Salisbury? And you can consider the institutional somatic norm at Manchester, not just in relationship to race, but also class and gender, and maybe other characteristics such as age, sexuality, and so on. How do you think your own social identity, your race, class, gender, and other social characteristics, how do you think they shape your experiences and viewpoint on this? The extent to which you see normalisation or don't? And Joseph-Salisbury and Anderson think that racially minoritised groups have a better understanding of power relations in institutional settings where they are not the norm, compared to majority groups, that is, majoritarian groups. What do you think about that? Do you agree with that?